I'm Bob McKelvey. I'm the president of the UN Association in Montana. And I am here simply to introduce our speaker, Daniel Levy. Mr. Levy is in this country attached to two what they call think tanks based in Washington, D.C. One is an old line organization called the Century Fund. The other one is a brand new, really innovative organization called the, I guess it's the Century Foundation.
Yeah.
Fund. The other one is called the New America Foundation. And it is very interesting in the makeup of its board of directors, which includes a number of very prominent academics, scholars, and people who are leaders in Silicon Valley kind of industries, in particular the CEO of Google. So this is an outfit that is trying to find change. It's looking for changes. And one reason that Daniel is there is because he has a perspective to give us, which is rather different from what we see typically in the local media, except for some who are here. KPAX is here. And perhaps sometime when you read the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker magazine, the Washington Post, these perspectives are represented there to a degree, but probably not to the extent that they should be. Then you grew up in Britain. There's a residue of that. We had to go over it before you came here and watch the last half of a soccer match in which his local North London team was involved, and I will not tell you how it came out, but it was somewhat badly. For example, in Britain, he did hang around there long enough to get a bachelor's and a master's with honors from Cambridge, King's College in Cambridge, with prizes in social and political sciences. He was a scholar of the college. And since then, when he moved to Israel, he began to publish in journals and also in the press. Haaretz, the progressive newspaper there, Jerusalem Post, sort of the centrist, the right of center these days, and in numerous places in the United States, Britain, around the world since. He went to Israel, where he now has dual citizenship, and worked, I believe it was the first thing that he was doing there, was being a part of the negotiating team for the Oslo agreements that Yitzhak Rabin was promoting. Of course, Rabin was assassinated. And after that, the Barak government formed, and then he worked in the office of the Prime Minister. He also worked with the Minister of Justice, Yossi Beilin, who is, I think now he's the head of the Meretz
Party, yeah.
Yes, which is one of the progressive parties in the Knesset. He continued to be involved in diplomatic activities for the Israeli government so long as the Barak administration and the Labor government on the left was there. And this was at the time of the Clinton administration, and so the U.S. government was supporting and promoting an agreement between Yasser Arafat and the Barak administration in Israel. The first try didn't quite make it. They went back for another try after the election in which Bush had triumphed, and made one last attempt at probably in the desert. Came very close to an agreement, but then the government fell in Israel. The government had changed in the United States, and there was less interest in pursuing the negotiations. Therefore, those negotiators who have been doing this for government began doing it in a private context, something called the Geneva Initiative. And Daniel was deeply involved in that. In the end, he was the chief drafter of the Geneva Initiative and continued after the negotiations ended. But I wanted to talk a little bit about what he did next, because then he became an analyst at an organization called the International Crisis Group. How many of you have heard of it? It's interesting that nobody knows what it is here, and yet it is one of the most important international NGOs dealing with issues of war and peace that there is. And interestingly enough, it was formed within the Catholic Church in association with the Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church. And everywhere where there is violence, controversy around the world, the International Crisis Group will have a presence with professional people observing and analyzing what's going on and telling the rest of the world. They did this in Yugoslavia. They are doing it right now in Palestine, in Darfur, in the Congo, and everywhere. And Daniel had an important role to play there. He was only there a year, I think.
Yeah,
Something
and we
like
did the
that.
Geneva thing.
So during that time, he was central, I've learned, he doesn't tell us all these things, in putting together another initiative which would have behind it the international recognition that the International Crisis Group has. I think that's called, what is it called, their initiative? It's just
The new one now.
It's
The
what?
new one now, or the one?
The new one now.
Well, it's a call for going back to Arab-Israeli peace.
The name exactly.
Doesn't really.
It's an initiative which is intended, according to the Voice of America, for example, to restart the Arab-Israeli peace process. The head of the International Crisis Group, the president of it, is the former U.S. ambassador to the UN, Thomas Pickering. And Thomas Pickering said about what they had done, and Daniel really drafted the text of what they did. He said, I think the crisis group is doing this in part because coming out of the really miserable conflict that we have just been through over Lebanon, there was a very strong sense of thinking that there is now a time and an opportunity, as there has been after most of the conflicts in the Middle East, to direct new energy into the Arab-Israeli peace process. The need is self-evident given all the turmoil and problems going on in the Middle East. And this initiative was sent out. Some 135 very prominent global leaders endorsed it. I have a list of them somewhere here, but it includes people like Jimmy Carter, Nelson Mandela, people of this ilk. So this is the main thrust, it seems to me, today. And it'll be part of the story, but certainly not all of the story that you're going to hear from Daniel Levy now.
I'd like to thank Bob for that introduction, and thank you for hosting me here, the UN Association, and thank the university for putting this together. This is going to go here. No, it's not. It's going to go here. And thank the university for putting this together, and you all, even the ones who I just signed up for God knows what to, for spending your afternoon here in this hall with me. When Bob told me before that we'd be doing something at 8:10 tomorrow morning, I thought, that must be obviously before classes start. If he's now telling me that that's when your classes start, I'm impressed. And this is for students only. Teaching staff should block their ears at this stage. The International Crisis Group that Bob referred to does excellent reports on virtually every conflict area. And if you're ever kind of in need of 30 quick pages that will get you through trying to get background on something very quickly without having to read several books, then go to crisisgroup.org. No, they produce very high quality policy material, and it really is a good place to start when you're dealing with many areas. What I want to do in this session, because later on I'm going to be doing something where I'm really going to look at where the Middle East is today, what are the policies that have been pursued that have got us to where we are today, and I'm really going to take that session this evening to speak about where I think US policy in particular has gone wrong in the last years in the Middle East, and why I believe that a very sober look at the Middle East today is required, and a quite serious rethink in terms of how to restabilize a region that I think is threatens to spill over and out of control in very dangerous ways, not only for the people in the region. That's this evening. What we've headlined this session about is something that perhaps doesn't get too much of an airing in the US in general, which is the peace camp in Israel, the Israeli peace narrative. And what I want to talk to you about now really is what is the thinking? What are the points of departure? What are the basic worldviews of the peace narrative in Israel? It's at least half of the Israeli population. Given the way the Israel-Palestine, Israeli-Arab issue plays out here sometimes, you would probably imagine that it's a terribly, terribly, terribly embattled, tiny minority. It's not. It's a very big voice in Israel, even if it's less of a voice here in the US. And I want to look at some of the recent developments, some of the thinking, some of the challenges, some of the shortcomings, and the prospects in terms of where we are today. And I'm obviously not going to go into these are the different organizations and these are the personalities and these are the movements. I'm going to try and keep it on more of a conceptual level because I think that would be of much more interest. Bob, you mentioned in your introduction Yitzhak Rabin, who most of you would remember. Yitzhak Rabin was twice the Prime Minister of Israel. He was Prime Minister of Israel from 1992 until his assassination in 1995. It just so happens that we're meeting today on the anniversary, according to the Hebrew calendar, of Rabin's assassination, actually pretty much at this very hour. It was at the height of the Oslo process, if people remember. Rabin and Arafat shook hands on the White House lawn on the 13th of September 1993, hosted by then President Clinton. There were the beginnings of Palestinian self-government in the occupied territories. There were the beginnings of talks between Israel and the Syrians. There was an Israeli-Jordanian peace deal. Israel and the PLO, who had been such bitter enemies, mutually recognized each other. And then on the fateful night when there had been much incitement, much really, really ugly political mudslinging, and I've been watching some of your campaign ads running up to your midterm elections, and some of it reminds me of that. And that ended with Rabin's assassination. There was a decision by the peace camp, and this would probably be as good a place as any to begin one story of the Israeli peace camp. There was a decision that the peace camp had to be out on the street, challenging those who were saying that Rabin was giving up everything, was giving in to terrorists, a defeatocrat for the 1990s, and that the peace camp had to re-seize the street. And so there was a huge rally in what is now called Rabin Square. Of course, then it was called the State Square in Tel Aviv. And having just sung to Israeli peaceniks our kind of anthem, which is called the Song of Peace, Rabin was descending from the steps and was assassinated, and the assassin was an Israeli Jew who is in prison until this day. Obviously, the situation today is not good, but what I want to start by doing is saying what is the Weltanschauung, the worldview, in generic terms, of the Israeli peace camp. And it won't surprise you, because it would be not dissimilar from similar perspectives in other parts of the world in conflict situations of those who are suing for a negotiated solution to a situation. And the position would be this: that Israel was created. The founding philosophy behind the establishment of a state of Israel was that a persecuted Jewish minority had to find a place in which it would have sovereignty, that would be its shelter, that would be its guarantee, and for historical religious reasons, the place was Zion. Now that involved a degree of injustice, I would say, to those who inhabited that area. But there was a UN decision, UN Resolution 181 in 1947, to establish a Jewish state and a Palestinian Arab state in the area that was then under British mandatory control. And the founding notion of Zionism was that this would fundamentally change the Jewish predicament, and as a result of the establishment of the state, I'm just going to have to deal with this, because otherwise I'm going to be caught up in the chair. As a result of the establishment of the state, the Jewish people would no longer face the kinds of existential threats that they had faced as a minority in other states. It was kind of a guarantor of last resort. Of course, Israel was established in 1948, 3 years after the end of the Holocaust and the end of the Second World War. The fundamental starting point for the analysis of people coming from the place where I'm coming from would be that if Israel is condemned to live in perpetuity at war with its neighbors, then the founding philosophy is wrong. In other words, if Israelis are condemned because they live in a sea of hostile Muslim Arabs who will never come to terms with their existence in the Middle East, if they are condemned to living there at war with these people, then the entire project was a big mistake. And from a Jewish perspective, the Jewish challenge should be building strong, reproducing, sustainable communities around the world. Rather than saying there should also be a state, there should also be a state that is seen as the Jewish state. Now, by the way, the definition of Jewish in terms of the Israeli state was never intended to be a religious one. In fact, Israel has always called itself a Jewish and democratic state. I don't want to go excessively into the history, but I do want to clear this up. Now, that is the point of departure for the entire narrative. Once you are in that place which says Israel is not condemned to living on the sword, living by the sword for 100, 200 years, then you have to get to grips with how does Israel become part of the Middle East. And the way that one would argue that Israel becomes part of the Middle East is to come to terms with its Arab neighbors and to reach peace agreements with all the surrounding Arab states, which involves ending the occupation. Of course, there is a perspective that would say the entire existence of Israel is a form of occupying lands that should not be Israeli. But what you have today, and for the first time in such an outspoken way, is an Arab willingness to say that an Israel that ends the occupation of 1967, not an Israel that ceases to exist, but an Israel that comes to peace agreements with its Arab neighbors, and maybe a parenthesized background line of history, 1967, Israelis call it the Six-Day War. Israel takes over territory from Jordan then, which is the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, part of the Sinai Peninsula, which was Egyptian, and the Golan Heights, which are Syrian. And the offer put on the table in 2002 by the Arab League, by the Arab states,
was that all the Arab world would recognize and create normal relations with Israel if Israel were to reach a comprehensive peace solution with its neighbors. And I'll come back to that initiative because, interestingly enough, it's being revived now after 4 years of essentially sitting and gathering dust. And of course, this comes from a perspective that says national security needs to be more broadly defined than the territory you hold and the weaponry at your disposal. In other words, the national security equation for a place like Israel is also about, are you guaranteeing, and this is particularly relevant for Israel, are you guaranteeing that your future generations are going to stay in Israel? Tiny country, 7 million persons. The nicely watered newspaper cutting that I have here from a newspaper a couple of weeks ago, and I just cut it out because I thought this really explains this point. 59% of students in Israel today, so these are the Israelis going on to higher education, are interested in having a second foreign citizenship, and their preference would be the US. 53% are interested in moving overseas. And the argument today, when you have a generation of young Israelis who, like yourselves, live on the internet, live in cyberspace, if they are being told that they, when they bring up their own families, their kids will have to go through the same experience of fighting war after war after war, they're saying, we're not interested in that. And the more Israel invests in its military, in having to fight wars every few years, the less we're investing in education, the less we're investing in our future. And that the only way Israel can secure and guarantee its existence in the Middle East is by coming to terms with its neighbors. And that the very act of maintaining an Israeli presence beyond our borders and in not having defined borders is itself a source of instability. And this gets to the core of a debate which of course rages in this country right now. Do they hate us? They, the baddies, the axis of evil, all those miscreants. Do they hate us for what we are? Or is there an element here of them hating us for the things we do? And quite often, the ones who hate us for what we are exploiting the things that we do in order to win others to their cause. And that's the fundamental question that Israel has to ask. Are we condemned to living in a sea of hostility? Or if you end the occupation, if Israel comes to peace agreements, negotiated agreements with its neighbors, does that in fact take away the source of the hostility? Does that drain the swamp of the anger? Does that remove the grievance that so feeds radicalism? So that's kind of the worldview that I wanted to put out there, because I think it's very important, especially in the issues that America is dealing with today, to understand that today in Israel, most Israelis get it. There's no such thing as a benevolent occupation. Occupation is occupation is occupation is occupation. And the people who are occupying tend not to like it. And when I read stories in the newspapers about checkpoints being put up all around Baghdad and in Sadr city, one of the main Shiite neighborhoods in Baghdad, I think, oh my God, what are you getting yourselves into? We've been there and we're still there and nothing good can come of it. Today there are 547, according to the UN, obstacles to freedom of movement for Palestinians in the West Bank. And I can tell you that a very many Israelis say what it provides us in security, because these checkpoints, these obstacles to movement in the West Bank, presumably are supposed to stop bad people with bad intentions coming close to good people who are Israelis who they want to do bad things to. But many, many people would say what it gives us, that added extra it gives us in security, is more than compensated for by the anger it breeds, by the hostility it breeds in that civilian population. Because, of course, checkpoints apply to everyone. And if you're a Palestinian trying to get from one village to the next village, and you're a kid and you see your parents humiliated at a checkpoint, or you're having to go for medical treatment and you're held up for 3 hours and you miss that treatment, it creates exactly the pool of anger and hatred that you say, you know what, to hell with it. I'm not going to be against the people who are carrying out violence. I'm pretty angry, and you know what, maybe I would do that violence as well. And so I shudder when I hear the stories of the checkpoint systems being set up, because we've seen where it leads to. Just a very interesting, I think, side story. During the Intifada has largely died down, but as you know, since September of 2000, there has been this ongoing violence between Israelis and Palestinians in the occupied territories. And one of the methods that at one stage the Israeli Defense Establishment used in order to try and deter the terror and the violence was something known as home demolitions. And the Israeli security forces would demolish the homes of the families of suicide bombers. Obviously, these people are suicide bombers. If they've been successful, then they're no longer alive. Their families are alive. And it was supposed to send out a kind of message. After 2 years of pursuing this policy, a panel was established inside the Israeli Defense Ministry to look into the effectiveness of this policy. And here, by the way, I give Israel credit. And I'm an Israeli, and I work in the Prime Minister's office. And I do give us credit because we do rethink in Israel. It may have taken us 2 years, but others sometimes take a lot longer. And this committee was set up, and lo and behold, surprise, surprise, what was the finding, the committee? But they came up with the finding, and they made it public, and they weren't afraid to change course. They came up with the finding that says, the anger caused by the home demolition policy and the recruitment incentive and assistance this gives to the terrorists is far in excess of any deterrent effect achieved. And so the policy was abandoned. What's the good news I can share with you? The good news I can share with you is that even if the narrative that I have just given you, even if I would say it would be a stretch to argue that that narrative is shared by the majority of Israelis, something has happened to the majority of Israelis. And it's a quite dramatic development over the years. Today you have a consistent majority and a clear majority of the Israeli public that supports a two-state solution, in other words, a state of Palestine alongside a state of Israel, that supports withdrawing settlements, that supports going back to negotiations. Now, of course, there's dissonance. I imagine that any society that lives in conflict carries with it many areas of dissonance. So at the same time that most Israelis are willing to do all the things that I just said, they don't trust the other side. They think that even if they leave the territories, the other side will continue to try to attack them. And yet what you've seen, and this has been a top-down process in many ways, by the way. It has less come from the citizenry than it has been a decision of Israel's leaderships in several key times to say we have to move forward either in making peace with our enemy and or in removing settlements or in leaving certain territories. And what this has done is it shattered certain myths that Israelis carried with them. And it's taken us to a position whereby today, as I said, you have a clear majority of Israelis who want out. Got to be honest with you. Not much of that is coming from a deep love of our neighbours or a deep empathy with their predicament. Most of this is a society that is fatigued, that has had enough of living in conflict, and that understands, which is a very difficult, and I don't want to make this simplistic. It's a difficult realization for a society to come to to understand the limitations of the use of power. It's a very important point. Israel is a regional superpower in many ways in the Middle East. Israel's military is not challenged in pure military terms by surrounding states. Sure, non-state actors can be a real headache. Sure, terrorists can cause terrible suffering and loss of life to innocent civilians. But there has not been, I should say, because there is an Iranian situation developing, but there has not been a serious military threat to Israel. And yet we have seen the severe limitations. And we saw them in the summer again. If people remember, there was a conflict that went on during the summer. For the American news-watching audience, it ended when that chap was discovered in Thailand who was linked to the missing girl and flown back business until they realised he had nothing to do with it. And that's when the Lebanon conflict ended in the American media. It ended a couple of weeks later on the ground. But there was this conflict in the summer, and Israel realised the limitations of the use of force. So, as I'm saying, on several levels, the good news is the willingness, even after that conflict in the summer, because obviously for many Israelis, that there were rockets launched at Israeli towns in the north for a period of 34 days, and people again went back to, as you can imagine, the stereotypes of we can't deal with these people, they want to kill us, etc., etc. But you still have a majority. Even the week after the cessation of hostilities in the summer, a poll was done and people were asked. If people remember the hostilities on Israel's northern border with Lebanon, in which we were fighting a non-state actor, the Hezbollah, the hostilities ended when a UN resolution was passed, UN Resolution 1701, which set up a series of things which both sides would do, including the upgrading, the beefing up of an existing UN presence that was already deployed in southern Lebanon, but that wasn't having too much effect. And that the mandate of that force and the troops in that force were all increased significantly. And Israelis were asked, would you support a similar solution in the West Bank? That Israel would leave the West Bank, the occupied Palestinian territory, and an international force would be placed there following Israel's departure. This is a week after war. It's not the best time often to ask these questions. You had 52% in favour of that versus 38% against. More recently, Israelis were asked, should Israel negotiate with a Palestinian unity government that includes the Fatah and the Hamas? And I don't want to go into internal Palestinian politics too much because I don't want to talk throughout. I want to shut up at some stage and have a Q&A. Hamas is a national Islamist Palestinian movement. Its charter is terribly troubling to read if at all, but especially if you're an Israeli Jew. And Israel has said that it's a terrorist organization. The US has defined Hamas as a terrorist organization. Israelis were asked, should the Israeli government negotiate with a government, a Palestinian government of Fatah and Hamas? And 67% said yes. Then they were asked, what if it's just a Hamas government, which is kind of what you have today? And 56% said yes. I just got given this poll today, which was remarkable, and it gives an outline of a very reasonable peace deal, not dissimilar to the Geneva Initiative. And again, a majority of Israelis support it. I want to try and move more swiftly on through the other points I wanted to cover before the ink totally runs. Having given that somewhat rosy picture, what are the things that are limiting, that are squeezing the debate inside Israel? And I'll just briefly mention a few of them. They're both internal and external, by the way. And the first one I'd mention is probably an obvious one. There are limitations to how far you can take a public down a peace narrative route when you're still in the heart of conflict. It's a very difficult thing. It's terribly difficult to create empathy on either side. By the way, of course, this applies equally to the Palestinians, equally to the Lebanese during the summer. To think that the people who you are at war with today, you can have a working peace process with, when on the Israeli side people are scared to enter cafes or go on buses, when the Palestinian side, every day there is an Israeli military presence in their lives. A very difficult thing to do. So the first thing is the practical situation of the conflict imposes limitations. The second thing which I would do a disservice to understanding the Israeli narrative if I did not mention it, is Jewish history carries with it, contemporary Jewish history carries with it, very complicated lessons for Israelis, for Jews today, regarding power, regarding threats against them. When an Ahmadinejad type character, the Iranian leader, talks about annihilating, destroying, wiping Israel off the map, alongside developing a nuclear energy program, which the US at least, and others, have said they believe is for the development of weapons, and then denies the Holocaust, this for a Jewish and for a Jewish Israeli mindset, is a terribly threatening thing. Some may look at this as domestic rhetoric aimed to please the punters in a town square somewhere in Iran. What Israelis hear is something deeply disturbing. Now, there is a strong sense that the world was not there to help us. We stand alone. We can only rely on ourselves. No one else will come in an hour of need. I should add, because I do believe this, that unfortunately I think that is also exploited and abused. I think sometimes the term anti-Semitism is thrown about with a haste and a generality and a misuse that actually does a disservice to the struggle against anti-Semitism. But nonetheless, this is part of the mindset, especially when people tend towards fatalism. What it also does is it makes it very difficult for Israelis to be cognizant of what the power dynamic is in the region. There was a wonderful phrase that I probably have to give a lot of historical background, but I'll try it anyway, just in brief, that was once used by a former Israeli prime minister called Levy to describe Israel's thought predicament when it comes to how it looks at its situation. And he said, Shimshon the Nebuchadnezzar. Now, all of you would have heard of Samson from the biblical stories. Nebuchadnezzar in Yiddish means poor little guy who's very, very weak. And the way of understanding Israelis was it's this strong Samson who sees himself as this poor, weak little guy who's on the verge of being extinguished at any given moment. So Israelis have all this power, but their self-perception is often one of deep, deep insecurity. And especially the difficulty in appreciating the impact and the control Israelis have over daily Palestinian life. I mentioned those 547 apparent, according to the UN, current obstacles to just daily movement from one road to another in the Palestinian territories. If you ask most Israelis, what's the situation on the Palestinian side, they would say, they can't get their act together. They've got their own government, we've even left Gaza, and yet they just can't get their act together. And to try and get people to appreciate that, yes, Palestinian governing institutions have not been a stunning success. There is an element of a failed state here, before it's even a state. I'd argue that in conditions of occupation, that was pretty likely to happen, because we never got rid of the occupation. But if you try and get Israelis to understand that actually, Israel still controls Gaza, Israel has a far greater say in daily Palestinian life than any Palestinian government minister, it's a stretch, understandably, for most people. The next next part of the narrative, or of the difficulty, the squeezes on the debate in Israel, is the military in Israel. And it's been fascinating for me spending 2 months in the US. Israel has conscription. Israel has a people's army. The Israeli military is really held up as one of the unifying factors in Israeli society. I think Israel goes to the opposite extreme of a spectrum in which I would say America's at the other end. What do I mean by that? In Israel, in many ways, and this is what happened in the summer, it is more difficult for Israel to absorb military casualties than civilian casualties. And that sounds totally absurd to anyone, right? Who thinks about, why do you have a military? You have a military to carry out missions that they know are going to be dangerous and people are going to lose their lives. Because everyone in Israel, everyone, from the Prime Minister to the anchor person on the news, to the business CEO, to your neighbor, to your friend, to your family, is or knows someone who is going to be involved in any given conflict. Absorbing military casualties is terribly difficult. What basically ended, in terms of the Israeli public wanting to see an end to the conflict in the summer, was that we were taking bad hits in our military. I say America is on the other end of the spectrum because having spent 2 months here, and every day, I read the New York Times every day, it's not surprising, and every day they list the names of the American fallen, that every time they're released by the DoD, by the Department of Defense. It's astonishing to me. I mean, okay, you've got a midterm election going on, and 103 of your kids have fallen in a terrible month that finished this morning. But it's astonishing to me. And maybe it's different in Montana. But it seems to me that in the elite, all those groups, the politicians, the elites in the media, the business elites, no one's there. Most of the people you're sending to Iraq are a voiceless, disenfranchised group. And I'd say that's the opposite extreme. So I think for Israel, maybe we're too sensitive to our military losses. It seems, and if I may just comment on having been here for 2 months, it seems to me that there's an excessive blasiness here in that respect. But the role of the military in Israeli self-understanding makes a debate very difficult. And I won't elaborate on that point for now. And the last point I'd make, well, two last points. One is, we don't have easy partners. Israelis will constantly say, where is the Palestinian peace camp? Where is the Arab peace camp? Partly it's a fair criticism. Partly it's a different set of expectations and cultural ways of doing politics and of doing civil society and of doing diplomacy. And partly, they're the people under occupation. There is an occupier-occupied relationship here, which people have to get over. But there is a question here of, I mentioned the Saudi initiative. This was an initiative that the Saudi leadership, at the time it was very associated with Crown Prince Abdullah. He is now the leader of Saudi Arabia since the death of the former Saudi leader. In 2002, there was an initiative to say, if Israel makes peace, that's interesting.
If Israel makes peace with its neighbours, all the Arab world will make peace with Israel. And the Arab League accepted that initiative. And that was it, though. There was no big public diplomacy. There was no effort to say to Israelis, hey, we've just made a big initiative. Come and talk to us. Come and listen to this. Let's all meet somewhere. Let's do some informal civil society gatherings. Let's invite your journalists over to interview us. It was a very un-Israeli, un-Western way of going about it. The Arab world felt it had made its statement. There was a document out there. It was very clear what was in the document, and anyone who wanted to know about it could read the document. Now, we all know that, if you want people to know about something, you do TV ads and you set up a 527 organization that's going to do, campaigns, and you do ads in the newspaper, and you do all manner of things. So a different way of going about things, which doesn't help people understand each other. And the last point here And I think with that I'll close and maybe just make a few comments about where to next. The last point here is the US role. One of the things, and this isn't an Israeli peacenik having a whinge, it genuinely is something that plays into the debate in Israel. One of the things that most limits the debate, or the opposite, or expands the debate, is what the US administration of the day is or is not doing. America has a historical position, consistently, of opposing what we call settlements and settlement expansion, which the establishment and nurturing and expanding of Jewish civilian areas in these occupied Palestinian territories. Because if one day there's going to be a Palestinian state, that's where it's going to be, and these settlements are going to be a bit of a problem. When the US government says nothing in the face of Israeli settlement expansion, it's much more difficult for those in Israel who are against settlement expansion to speak out. Because the default Israeli position in the mainstream media and establishment is, well, if the Americans are saying it's okay, who are you to say it's not okay? And I have this conversation with people in the administration. And I say to them, you know what, you don't want to put a peace plan out, at least vocalize your historically consistent positions. And it's something that Americans don't appreciate. That sometimes not saying something can have a booming echo effect. Another example was in the summer. Fuad Signora, the Prime Minister of Lebanon, is considered an ally of the US. Fuad Signora said, are you really going to sit there and say nothing while my country is being destroyed? And how do you think this is going to make me look? Do you really want to weaken me? And the US said, we cannot go back to the status quo. We cannot have a cessation, an immediate end of hostilities until we build the basis for long-term stability, which sounds very nice. What it means is, Israel, you have a green light to continue the offensive. And you know what? Israelis didn't, I believe, Israelis did not expect that green light. I think Israel has had an unbelievable luxury in the world, that Israel can do something militarily and always have an exit strategy. Everyone talks today about exit strategies. Israel has had the most fantastic exit strategy, I believe, historically. You do something, and then the Americans, and they're our friends, so when America says it to us, it's not some kind of nasty slapping. Our American friends say, you were right in what you did, absolutely justified. And by the way, the attack regarding Lebanon, this was an unprovoked act of aggression by Hezbollah against Israel. And the Americans say, you're absolutely right, you had every right to respond, it was justified, and now it's time to move on to diplomacy. For 34 days that didn't happen over the summer. Saying nothing can have a bigger boom in terms of its echo effect sometimes than doing things. And look, I understand that Stephen Walt, I don't know if any of you were at that lecture, was here a couple of months ago giving a lecture. I don't agree with everything in the Walt Mearsheimer paper. My take on this is that there has developed in recent years two sets of organic relationships, strong relationships, political relationships between groups in Israel and groups in the US. One of those is a very, very strange marriage of convenience. There is here in the US the Christian evangelical so-called pro-Israel right. And they have a very strong relationship with the settler movement, with the radical right wing in Israel. Of course, one is radically Christian and the other is radically Jewish, and they really don't agree on a lot of theological things, and they certainly have a very, very different vision of what the end of the days look like. But right now, they have a marriage of convenience. And that's a strong, political, mutually supportive relationship. There's a second one between a group of ideologues, and those of you who follow this will know the phrase neoconservatives. A group of ideologues who have fed very effectively into the thinking of the current administration called the neocons, the neoconservatives. And they have a deeply mutually supportive, organic, ideological relationship with what I would call old school Likud in Israel. Likud is the traditional right-wing Israeli party. Now they are only 10% of the Israeli Knesset. People who have held high office and been high advisors to this administration, Richard Pearl, Elliot Abrams, Doug Feith. Google any of them and you'll understand what you're doing in the Middle East today. In 1996, a chap called Bibi Netanyahu, many of you would have heard of him, got elected as Israeli Prime Minister, as the head of the Likud party. They wrote a paper for him called the Clean Break Strategy. Now, Bibi never implemented it. It said, he implemented some of it, but he didn't implement a lot of it. End the peace process with the Palestinians, it said. Push for regime change in Iraq and Syria. Make the Jordanian Hashemites the rulers in Iraq. Now, these same people suddenly found that what was rejected by the Israelis as being a bit too out there in 1996 suddenly found a welcoming ear over here, not in 2000 or January 2001, but of course in September and October of 2001, where the landscape here and the way of understanding America's role and place and how to respond was suddenly up for grabs. There is not, and I guess this is my main point, because yes, there is a strong pro-Israel community. To me, what they consider to be pro-Israel, I think, is a disaster for Israel. It's not a monolith. There are very, very many progressive Jewish voices in this country. They're not heard as often. Most American Jews, surprise, surprise, given that they tend to be liberal on most things, are also liberal on this. They support a peace process between Israelis and Palestinians. They support American involvement. They don't support the kinds of strange legislation that others encourage Congress to adopt and that unfortunately most of your members sign up to, it would appear, without giving too much thought to it. But there is not a third relationship. There is not a relationship between a peace camp in America and a peace camp in Israel. Not only progressive Jews, who have some kind of a relationship, but it's a weak one. And if anything, you know, there's something of a mutual suspicion. The kind of peace camp left in America and the peace camp in Israel kind of have an uneasy relationship, to the extent to which they have any relationship at all. Some of the peace camp left in America feels that the entire project of Israel is a bit colonialistic, unfortunate for their liking. And the Israelis pick up on this, and they don't feel comfortable with that. So we miss having something that could be a counterweight to those two relationships that I just described. Where does that leave us today? Because I've spoken much longer than I intended to, and I've spilled far much more water than I intended to as well. Look, the summer war between Israel and the Hezbollah in Lebanon and the ongoing conflict with the Palestinians obviously makes people more suspicious, distrustful, unbelieving that you can have peace with the Arabs. It also makes people even more keen to just get past this and put it behind us. You know, when a majority of your population no longer thinks that you have a role to play in the occupied territories, and again, as I say the sentence, it reminds me of other things. It makes that very difficult to sustain. The majority of Israelis know that we're leaving the West Bank sooner or later. And so it makes it more difficult to send your kids or to go yourself as a reserve soldier, guarding a settlement that you're pretty damn sure is going to be evacuated in the near future. There is also the beginnings of Israelis turning round and saying, you know what? I'm not sure this current American policy is helping Israel too much in the Middle East. I'm not saying that there is kind of some Israeli Hugo Chavez character in the barrios of Tel Aviv campaigning against the evil Yankee. But what you do have is more and more Israelis saying, this stirring up of a hornet's nest, this deep instability, and as the American National Intelligence Estimate itself said, strengthening of radical jihadists as a result of Iraq and other things, this has got to be bad news for us. 140, 150,000 American troops are going to go home one day, sooner or later. All Israel's troops and all Israel's civilians are still going to be in the Middle East. And there's the beginnings of a sense that this is terribly dangerous to Israel. I'm not sure what that translates into yet. I do think we're at a moment that cries out for initiative. I don't know if it will come from Israel. I don't know if it will come from the US. Some people think that this Baker-Hamilton study group that I mentioned earlier, the Iraq War Study Group, may develop into a bigger rethink on the Middle East. Maybe it will come from civil society. The effort that Bob referred to, this very detailed model Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement that I had the privilege of being involved with. When that was released, that generated momentum, and politicians had to respond, and they came up with their own plans. So it could come from any number of places. But there is a sense that at the most basic level, actually, the sense is it's a pretty binary option. If there is not a renewed effort at peacemaking, there's going to be a new outbreak of conflict and bloodshed. That's what I wanted to share with you.
Well, we have about 10 minutes, and why don't you just point it out to people?
If people can just introduce themselves.
Sure.
Please.
I'm Bruce Russell. I probably am one of those people who would be interested in a peace relationship from the United States to Israel, but there are a lot of impediments, and the impediments are the deep-seated feelings of outrage over the Summer's War, the fact that there were some 29 members of the Hamas government who were rounded up and fed the warmongering, the fact that you used the term non-state actor to refer to the Hezbollah political machine in Lebanon, when we know full well that Lebanon was virtually, the infrastructure was virtually destroyed. It was not an attack on Hezbollah, it was an attack on Lebanon. Today there were overflights in order to prevent the Hezbollah government from producing a unity government with Hezbollah. Today, there were 8, I think, Palestinians killed in Gaza due to an invasion of Israel. So these things, they are real. They are impediments to a peace relationship with a peace party in Israel. Would you respond to why you use the term non-state actor to refer to the Summer War?
Because Hezbollah was not launching the military attack over the border as the Lebanese state. Hezbollah is part of the government. Hezbollah, look, I totally agree with you. Perhaps wrongly, in the 1980s, Israel thought it could kick the PLO out of Lebanon. If anyone thought you could kick the Hezbollah out of Lebanon, you don't understand Lebanon. Hezbollah is the Shia population in Lebanon, just like you can't kick the Hamas out of Palestine. Hamas is a Palestinian organization. The reference to a non-state actor is that the Hezbollah act was not conducted by the Lebanese army, for instance. The Hezbollah militia that they maintain is a non-state militia. It's not a national army. It's not under the control of the Lebanese state. So in that respect, I think it's fair and accurate, without getting too much into the definitionals of it, to call them that. I think it was it was another demonstration of how good we are at winning hearts and minds through guns and bombs. When Israel thought, Hezbollah attacked us. If we now smash up Lebanon, then the Lebanese will understand that the people to blame aren't us, it's Hezbollah. It didn't work that way. Surprise, surprise. So apparently, we're not alone in doing not very good hearts and minds winning. I'll take.
You said that you did not agree with everything published in the Walt Mearsheimer paper. I wonder if you agree with their main claim that the Israel lobby was the indispensable agent for plunging the United States into the Iraq War.
No. And that's one of the main things I disagree with them on. I just think they've called it wrong. I think they're a group of ideological neocons who, I think AIPAC has made, in the series of mistakes that AIPAC have made over the years, if their real interest was Israel and America's security, one of the biggest was when they went into bed with the neocons. But, I mean, there is a tail and there is a dog. The neocons wanted the war in Iraq. The Israeli security establishment was happy to see the decapitation of an enemy regime. But they were smart enough to know, and there was a debate. It wasn't made public because they didn't want to be out of step with the American administration that wanted this war badly and was trying to sell this war. And of course, they mobilized AIPAC to help sell the war, yes. But were the plans drawn up in AIPAC headquarters? Absolutely not. I think AIPAC gets enough things wrong, and one can criticize AIPAC for the things it's actually doing. But it doesn't have the omnipotence that they described, and it wasn't the main actor. Inside the Israeli security establishment, there were voices saying, hey, can we think about kind of day 7 or day 1007? What might this do to Iran? Iran is the strategic threat. Don't we want that balance of power in that area between Iran and Iraq? Can you guarantee the outcome on this one? It's admittedly, in hindsight, more and more people are saying that's what they said at the time. But I mean, on that specific one, I mean, that would be my understanding of it. And therefore, one of the things that yes, I think that the debate here is carried off into unhelpful directions by groups like AIPAC. And I think sometimes, it's just unhealthy, and to me, it's also deeply un-Jewish to try and stifle debate. And I think there's an element, and a quite strong element, that happens. There's this legislation that's going, that happily has not passed. And actually, it's one of those occasions where I think sometimes we attribute to them more power than they have. There's a resolution called the Palestinian Anti-Terrorism Act that started moving through Congress after Hamas won the elections. And it creates the most draconian set of obstacles to any American aid to the Palestinian territories, not to the government, not to Hamas, any aid. Any working with Palestinians now or in the future, all kinds of things, way in excess of Israeli policy. There's a senator here who was in favor of it. And he wasn't alone, by the way, and this is both parties are culpable for supporting this kind of stupidity.
By a senator here, you mean in Montana?
Yeah.
In case anybody missed.
No, but really, on both sides, the behavior was.
Do you think a peace process can proceed between Israel and its local neighbors like the Palestinians and Lebanese without including the regional neighbors like Iran? It seems to me now there are other interests, others with an interest perhaps in not, for their own political reasons, not having a peace that complicates the local negotiations.
Maybe I'll take more than one question because I think we're going to have to wrap up. And I see there's one right. No, there's a bottle of water being passed.
I don't know if you've had a chance to see the latest New York Review of Books, and there's a letter to Foxman, head of the Anti-Defamation League, because the Anti-Defamation League apparently attacked Tony Yood and prevented him from speaking. And I think that it's to just call them neocons is giving a wrong impression. I think there has always been a very powerful Jewish lobby that has had tremendous effect on the voting patterns. I think that the state of Israel was in a way encouraged by Truman because he needed the Jewish vote. And I think this is something that's very, very difficult to talk about in this country, because lots of people don't want to go back that way. And I think all of us are afraid that it can be picked up in the wrong way. And I'd like you to speak to that. To how can we criticize and yet not really just feed red meat to some?
That's the question. First of all, on Israel and its neighbours. So maybe is there any other questions? And I'll just. Okay, so we'll take. I'll answer these two as briefly as I can. Israel and its neighbours. Yes, there will be other neighbouring but not direct neighbours who can play a spoiler role. I think it can be done without the Iranians as part of the equation. I also follow what the Iranian position is. And when even Ahmadinejad tried to kick back and say the Iranian position is Israel must go full stop, he was knocked into line by the Supreme Council and others in the leadership there who say we will not be more Catholic than the Pope. If the Palestinians elected representatives reach an agreement with Israel, we will not oppose that. Now, whether that would stand the test of reality, unfortunately, we don't know. I'd love us to find out. And I certainly think we should test it. Your question requires several hours. And it's one of the things that most occupies me in my time here. I'd like to draw a distinction. I draw a distinction between the particular point of departure that I think begins in 9/11, and it's when a group of ideologues grab a hold of American regional Middle East policy, and they still haven't fully let go. I distinguish between that and an ongoing close relationship buttressed by organizations who have a lot of strength, who are just effective lobbies. You know, the NRA is an effective lobby. So I distinguish those.
By the American people in general and continuously since the establishment of the state.
Yes.
It's buttressed by that as well.
I agree. I absolutely agree. And you see, that's important for Israel. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's very important for Israel in the region to have this relationship. Now, first of all, I think that they've lost the plot a bit, and that's what worries me. It worries me because I think that there is the prospect of a backlash, as you say, of feeding red meat. And it's hubris. It's arrogance to do what was done to Tony Jutt. Especially when, and I don't want to get into the minutiae because probably only half a dozen people in the room at that will follow this. Israel has just welcomed into its cabinet a guy called Avigdor Lieberman. He's the head of a very far-right party that the editorial in Haaretz called racist, that one of the Labour ministers quit the government and called racist fascist. So, this isn't, it's a big deal. And, I was in half a mind to send Abe Foxman a pack of throat lozenges. Abe Foxman is the head of the Anti-Defamation League. I presumed the reason he hadn't spoken out on this issue was that he had a bad bout of laryngitis. How can you take the positions that he has taken consistently and not speak out on this? So I think this has gone off in directions that are deeply troubling, deeply unhelpful, and I think that we have to, because I still think there is a we that represents, I can't speak as an American Jew, I can speak as a Jew, but I think the majority of American Jews are not comfortable with many of the positions, if they knew they were being taken. And there are efforts afoot, and of course there are organizations that exist already. Because one can line up a deep commitment to Israel, a firmly pro-Israeli rooted policy that also serves the American interest and is about US engagement in order to achieve peace in the region. That's good for Israel, good for America, and good for the region. And that's where, and by the way, there was a guy called Clinton, I don't know if people remember him. He brought the parties to Camp David in July of 2000. He put out there a plan in December of 2000. No one thinks of him as someone who was either anti-Jewish or anti-Israel or had Israel's worst interests at heart. It's doable. People have to rediscover that language. What has happened under this administration, when the Saudis put out their initiative, no one tried to do anything with it. Arafat died. He was the big nemesis, fine. Rightly, wrongly, I don't buy into that whole thing. Arafat died. Was there any effort to work with Abu Mazen? No. Ariel Sharon withdrew from territories. An entire new political party was created in Israel called Kadima. They're in government today, based on a platform of leaving territories. Did anyone say, how can we help you? Everything that's happened and not one serious effort at stringing together a peace process.
It's my guess that
It's my guess as well. Maybe if there's a couple more and we'll...
But I think we have to stop.
I just want to take... I'm going to take these two.
There is a...
Yes, I'm not in charge. Yeah, so we'll carry that on in the assembly.
You can continue the conversation. I don't want everybody to dribble out the door.
Thank you very much.